A Stanford K. smoker, Stan Smoker as we all know him, arrived in Fort Lauderdale in the 1950s with his wife and 3 children, leaving the family business in Indiana. I'm glad to be talking to you today, Mr. Smoker. Now, what was the lure that brought you to Fort Lauderdale?
Well, I tell a story when I'm asked when was the first time I came to Florida. I came in 1923, and people say, "My gosh, that guy's really old." My father and mother brought me down on the railroad, Flagler's Railroad, to the Palm Beach Flagler Hotel for about 2 weeks, and I was 3 years old. And I didn't come back till after the war. I think it was 1954. We were in the mobile home business, and I had a mobile home in the Miami show. And I just fell in love. Well, I missed that. I came down in 40 after I had appendicitis after I graduated, and I stayed here for 3 weeks with a doctor and his wife in Hollywood. So I was here 3 weeks in 1940. And then in 54, again, and I quit my father's business and came here in 56, in the summer of 56.
Tell us, Stan, what was your impression of Fort Lauderdale when you first came here as a permanent resident in the mid-50s?
Frank, I fell in love with it. I mean, I just couldn't believe. I think there was something like 56,000 people here. And I was a small town guy. I was already 33. And I'm a boater. We were in the boat business. I always lived around the lakes in Indiana. So I was a perfect match for me. And I had, back somewhere during the war, I was in the Army Air Force hospital for 90 days, and I used to think about being down in this area and being able to go to the islands, and I dreamt of having an airstrip, and all those things came way early. But we had a family business, and nobody left the family. We were long-range Amish background, and we were clannish, and there were 56 of us, 56 of family members, and 11 of us in the business, and it was pretty crowded, so I left rather. It was a little interesting. I was head of the PTA, and I wanted to build a new grade school because it was pretty run down, and my uncles were politicians, and they wanted to put a new cafeteria on the high school, and I thought I could beat them, and they pounced me good. In fact, I got over politics real quick. I've never liked politics. You're in it, and I'm not. But anyway, I did come down rather pretty disgusted with everything, and I thought I'll go as far as I can go. And I had been here, like I say, in 54.
Good.
And so that's the reason.
And now, once you settled here in the Fort Lauderdale area, Stan, with your family, you began a constructions material business. What did that consist of?
Well, I took a job at $1 an hour with a concrete company, and I was given an old truck. And everybody else had new trucks, but I found out something. I found out I didn't know anything about the Civil War. I was a Northerner, and they called me a Yankee, and they really hired me to give me the bird. And so basically I caught on real quick, and I decided to live it out, and through cleaning my truck, dressing right, doing the right things I knew what the boss wanted, I got up. That was all I can tell you. Concrete business was secondary to enjoying Fort Lauderdale.
Yeah.
We came to enjoy Fort Lauderdale.
Now, early on, Stan, you talked about the great potential of the New River anchoring a vibrant urban center, which personally I think that was great vision on your part. Now, You purchased land eventually along the New River. There were historic structures involved on that land, and preservation became very important to you. Talk about that and how important preservation is, especially on the land that you purchased.
Well, after I left the concrete business, I went out to the islands for a couple of years. We had sent materials out while I was with Hudai, and it was a concrete product, and we'd sent and built a hotel in the islands. So I spent 2 years learning to do real estate, and I was a U.S. broker for them. I came back in at the end of 1967, and at that time, I really was conscious of the fact that the islands were pristine, and so I wanted to come back in and look at what was happening here. And I was reading a lot of inspirational things, like from Earl Nightingale and such, and they were telling us that there's more to life than just making money. I don't know whether I can tell you this, Frank, but one of the things that shaped my life, I came from a very strict family, but one of the things that shaped my life here was when old George King was teaching the first Dale Carnegie class in 1957, 58. And the Bordemeyer boys were there, and it was about the only ones I knew. And he said, you know, we want to ask you for a goal, all of you, write it down. They did. Each one got up as his goal was read. He wanted a short-term goal and a long-term goal. And I had never thought of a goal. I was 33, had come out of the Air Force, and I never thought of a goal. And it's important I tell you this. My goal, I wrote down what I thought was my goal at that time. And they read everyone's goal. There's 30 in the class. And everyone was monetary. Someone wanted to be a millionaire. Somebody wanted on the intercoastal. It was totally monetary. They got to mine, and he got to laughing before I ever read it. He said, this guy wants to be the best liked man in town, short term, and he wants to go to heaven when he dies. And that's what I put down. When I walked out the back of the room, Kenny Bordemeyer came up and said, Smoker, I want to meet you. And he said, I want to bet you $50 you won't even make the first one. It was almost 40 years later when he left for Atlanta to do business. He came up to the Landmark Bank building, threw $50 on me, said, you win the first one, which, you can't make all friends, but I really came here to stay. And my family are all here. All three of my kids are well planted here, and that was the goal. The short-term goal was to be here.
You mentioned a couple of the names of the early folks that you met here, but what are a few of the other gentlemen and ladies that you met when you first came to town that you were inspired by, or they were inspired by you, and perhaps you did some business together?
Well, I think probably going back one-on-one, Gene Whidden was really an inspiration, not only with the college starting it, but we had the tunnel had just gone in, and Gene used to take his phone, and one of the first phones, and go down under the tunnel and call me up in the Landmark and say, you hear me? He was that kind of an entrepreneur. But there were some beautiful people here. Henry Kinney, of course, was fighting the tunnel thing for the Miami Herald. The Gores were trying to keep it from being built, and so I got in on the tail of that. But there were so many men. Henry Kinney was one of the people I really enjoyed. But there was Easter Lily Gates was one of those things, people that I admired. And there were so many people. Bob Gore became a friend of mine, and he became a dear friend. I don't think he had many close friends, but there were dozens of people that were beautiful, beautiful people.
Now, Stan, you had plans for putting up high-rises along the New River in the early 70s. but expansion of the courthouse, I think, shelved those plans in those days. But you did become a prominent developer in the area. But talk about your plans on your property there, adjoining the New River.
Well, I used to sit on the porch of Mrs. Stranahan when I first came in 1957. I had a small my daughter was only 1 year old. This gal sitting here with me was 1 year old at that time, and I I somehow or other saw that the town was really small. I mean, it was big for me, but it was just starting, and I could see the potential. And I used to sit with her, and she was trying to figure whether to sell the Stranahan house to the Blackwells. The Blackwells were in there with a restaurant on the front end of the Stranahan house. And I used to talk to her about the value of her house, and she should never let it go. And not knowing that George English was her attorney, but she used to tell me about the fact that if she did go, Stanford, she said, go to the Seventh-day Adventist Church in Orlando if you're really interested in it. So I called George up when she died. I said, George, I said, we got to go. He's already been in there for years, knew everything about what I was trying to tell him. But anyway, then I would go also at the time to Annie Beck's. And it was later, after talking one day, almost 10 years later, that we were talking, Mrs. Stranahan and I were talking, and I asked her who had the house across the way. I had not gotten to that point. She said it was my sister-in-law. Mr. Marty was the brother to Mrs. Stranahan. And I said, do you think, and I had no idea what I was talking about. I said, do you think that we should save that house? She said, well, it'd be nice. And I said, do you think she'd sell it? Frank, at that time, I didn't have any idea of a plan. We were just usually talking about the things, and I was learning a great deal from Annie Beck. And, you know, I did go across the way, and I said, would you give it? She said, no, go over there. So I sat on her swing. We always used to sit on the swing of all those ladies. And I sat on the swing and asked her whether she'd sell that house. And I'd like to do something with it, but maybe just keep it there at that time. And she said, well, I got to ask my son. And she did. She came back and she said she'd sell it for $56,000. Money was very cheap then. I mean, things weren't, no one valued the land. And so I told her I'd find a buyer for it. I didn't have the money even for it. That was $20,000 down. And so I did find a buyer, a lady, and I had to figure out why she should buy it. So I made a plan. It was on the cuff. I told her if she would buy it, put up to $20,000, I could get her a 3-year mortgage with Mrs. Marty. And I said, I will guarantee you that I will get this zone, this residential, for 100 units per acre. That's when I decided that that was still open there, and I somehow at that. So this lady bought it. I promised her to keep her roof, to repair anything in the house, even guaranteed her she could rent it if she wanted to, just to keep it and hold it. I asked her for 1 year's option, and she gave it to me free, 1 year's option to buy it back. And I told her I would buy it back, and I would do all the payments at one time, and I would pay her 10%, not on the $20,000 that she had invested, but in the whole $56,000. You couldn't. It was a deal you couldn't walk away from, and that's what started it. And that's what we did, and I got a free option for a year.
Good. A terrific story, a terrific historical piece there, Stanford. Now, the King Cromartie home was built in 1907. So by the time you were involved in it, it was quite old, and we appreciate everything that you did because, again, I see the vision that you had and the importance of preserving these old structures for future generations to know about the early history of Fort Lauderdale. Now, there's a 130-year-old oak tree that we know about that you helped preserve. It was at East Las Olas and Tarpon Drive. Do you remember that, and do you know the story behind that?
Oh, sure. We owned that piece of property. I gathered that piece of property after we built the Northern Trust, and we built this 5-story Hemmershey building on that area. And my son built that at home later on close in the 90s, and he dedicated that to my wife, who died after she was 56. Evelyn was 56 years old. I mean, it was 56 years of marriage, I'm sorry. It was year 2000, and my son guaranteed her while she lived that we moved that tree, and I give that credit for my son, and we moved it across the street from where the Hemmershey building is, Hemmershey Landings building is.
And how old was that tree?
I was in 140, 30. Nobody knew for sure, but it was huge, and it took about 20 men, and I think it cost a lot of money, but it was too beautiful to chop down. Yeah. Oak trees became, it's funny, back in those days, I hoped that we would get into that, but back before the county took that land away from me, that was not really a big deal in those days. Trees were not yet wherever, but Ann Kolb was a friend of mine. I was county commissioner, and she and Tom, oh gosh, I knew I would forget that, Tom's name. He was a reporter for the Miami Herald, and he was bearing down on me pretty hard about the trees. That was coming after I had the plans, after I had the permit and everything. I was getting, it was before I had the permit. And Ann Kolb was on my back, and we were friends, so I had to redesign the whole product. I was building 2 high-rise buildings, one on the north, called Las Olas North, and New River South. 400 units on the north bank and 400 on the south bank. I had gathered 8 acres, 5 on the south bank and 3 on the north bank. Where the Grand is and where the Water Garden is, those were the area. And on the south, you have the 400 units there of on the old smoker park and behind the smoker park. I get a little tangled on that, but basically those were trees that were very, very beautiful, about 3 acres of hemlock. And I started to redesign the whole product and did design it into 3 separate high-rises. And we did pick up the financing, and we were going ahead with the project. George Caldwell had moved on the site when the county came along and said, we want to take this land.
Yeah, oh boy. I want to talk a moment about the Smoker Family Park, Stan. It's a lovely oak-shaded green space located just west of the Henry Kinney Tunnel and dedicated to your family. But talk about the Smoker Family Park for a moment, how that all came about.
Well, as I said, trees, when I first bought that piece was part of the North American land, the Gore property, and when the tunnel was put through, they lost interest in that piece, and that's how I was able to get that 3 acres. Yeah. And Jesse Gaddis had the cab company behind. I was able to get that. And then all at once it became very, very obvious that was a lot of oak trees to cut down. And it didn't start out that way, but it developed that way over the period. And that period was from 1968, when I got the Cromartie house, to 1971, when I had all my permits. I had zoned at 100 units per acre, both north and south of the river. And at that time, we also had picked up some financing from some New York, very good people from New York. And I was able then to go up on Los Olas itself, where Jackson is now, and go down through there and purchase the Boulevard Hotel, which was on the corner, a two-story, 33 unit. The Briley Apartments was 33 units, retirement, right where the Grand is now. Mrs. John Fleming and Foy Fleming's mother had a beautiful home right there where the Grand is. And then Dr. Carutz owned a vacant lot. I was able to persuade him. And then the Bickelhoff Apartments went over next to Scotty Wilson's. And Scotty and I never got together, but I did have that 3 acres, which eventually was bought up by the Tribune, by the newspaper, and then went to Stiles and to Heisinger.
Yeah. Interesting piece of history there. Now, in retrospect, when you look back a few decades, Stan, are you pleased with the progress and the growth of Fort Lauderdale during the past decades? And talk about that for a moment.
You know I'm pleased.
Yeah.
And I mean, what Charlie Palmer did along the North Bank, I couldn't have done anywhere near as well. He did beautiful building, and the Weather Garden is a beautiful building. Jackson came in and at least had to be all torn down. It's not known, but Mrs. Stranahan and I got together. She had what we call a Ohio house. It was a number 2 house. It was right behind where Jackson's rear of Jackson Steakhouse is. And I bought that from her also. So I did that transaction with her in the early days. Then there was Mrs. Mary McCahill and Barnett, the attorney, were big people in the Museum of Arts. And that was in that road that I was picking up, which is, I picked up most everything from the area of Jackson all the way down to 3rd Avenue, including where the Bunnings the florist was. But when I got to the Museum of Arts, they owned 100 feet on Los Olas. That's where the Museum of Arts was. And I tried to buy it, and I was treated rather roughly by Barnett Elliott. And so I went and checked it out, and I found out that they didn't own the land underneath them. So I bought the land underneath them, and Gamble and Gilroy were my architects. Duncan Britt was my engineer. So we had designed a high-rise office building where the Bunning was on 3rd Avenue, and a high-rise hotel where Jackson is, right on 5th there. So in between, we were going to do a double-deck parking area of all that back, and I had tried to buy her air rights. I didn't want to move it because I thought that was sacred. Well, when I called up Mr. Barnett, and I said, I think you ought to talk to me. And he gave me a kind of a rough time, and I said, I think you better. I said, I own the land underneath you. So we did go, and the meeting was a lot like ours today. We were just sitting there, and they were waiting for me to come with a hammer. And I said, all I want is your air rights, and I'll sell you back whatever I paid for this. And I want you to stay. I'll give you free parking above. And so I have a nice letter from Mrs. McCahill. And that was that kind of things that you did meet the people in town one by one by one. And I wanted to say that Clint Gamble, Duncan Britt, Birch Willie, Ted Drum, some of those men became my very close friends.
Well, now, again, wonderful piece of history you're giving us. Where do you think this beautiful city will be in the next 20, 30 years, 40 years down the road after we're all gone away from here? What is the future of Fort Lauderdale?
Well, you probably could tell me in a quick. We have such a great future. I mean, we are, I think, stacked between Palm Beach and Miami. We're in the heart of the metropolis, and we're no longer a small town. It's pretty hard to find anybody you know at a restaurant. But the talent that I knew is, of course, not here. But the vision that I had didn't come near as big as what's happened. And it's, I think, developed into a beautiful, beautiful, beautiful city. And I'm proud to be here, and I don't ever want to leave it, because I've gotten my first wish. I really have a lot of friends. And I think that I made the right move. And I have a feeling that I was meant to be here, and that I do have a feeling that I did help along the way to do this. The DDA, the downtown development, did so much in those early days when we were all green. Nobody had ever done anything like that practically in the U.S. We were very conscious of not wanting to get any government money. We wanted to do things on our own. I was the only developer that was talking about putting houses in, but I was doing that, or housing. I was doing that before they got really the bond issue. So I happened to fall into the fact that I was ahead of the curve on that I was already gathering the land. It soon became evident that once it was known that the DDA had gotten a $12.5 million bond issue in, and that there was a very large vote, around 200 of the owners of business was a large yes vote on that. But I think that you'll find that that was probably one of the very critical things. And after that happened, we could notice, and of course, two things happened. Air conditioning came in during that time, and we got rid of carpets could be coming in. Mosquitoes were taken care of, and the women now would come down and live here. So that was essential, I think, in that time. But also, I used to call it the Black Hat area. That was the first that I had seen Wall Street people start to come in, 1970. And but we had a downturn around 73. But in that time, the major people were starting to come into town, and land went through the roof. And it was too late to do what I did, and it would have been probably impossible to do it in the downtown area. I ended up with 10 acres, two acres on Los Olas on the south side, 3 on the riverside on the north side, and 5 below. So that was a lot of land. And Jimmy Carter was in at that time, and we had 13% interest, and it was killing me. So probably that was the story that you couldn't have done it again.
Stan, when you talk about Miss Ivy Stranahan and the business that you were able to accomplish with her, now, what type of a lady was she?
Ivy Stranahan was a very, very knowledgeable and astute woman, and I used to get so much pleasure out of going over the ideas that I had. When I got the idea to do the towers over the river, 18-story towers connecting the 2 buildings, the people that I knew in town said, Ivy Stranahan will hate that. So I went over with the big picture that Gamble and Gilroy had done, and I took it over to her and sat down. I said, Miss Stranahan, what do you think of this? and she loved it. And, you know, it was that kind of a woman. She was forward thinking. It was just, you can't think of what a pleasure it was to have somebody that had been there from the very start, that was still in good health and good mind and could discuss the modern day things. She was delighted that something was happening downtown, and nothing was. Before the DDA started and before I started together, there was nothing happening. People like Birch Willie was here at the same time as myself. He had the hobby house. Pop Sterling was downtown. But there were small businesses. Mrs. Stranahan was really, really forward thinking and wanted to see things happen. So that was contrary to what people that didn't know her. She was a lovely, lovely lady.
Stan, let's talk about the King Cromartie home and its movement to its present location.
The King Cromartie house was a treasure, but I didn't know what to do with it. If I was going to develop it, I would have to either tear it down or move it. I didn't have the funds to move it. So Sandy Castile and Virginia Young came to me and suggested that they move it down the river and establish a historical area. And I said, great, because I had no plans at all. I wasn't in any hurry to do it. But anyway, they got the junior league, and I had no money I couldn't even purchase the house at that time. But when I did, I gladly deeded it over, and that was a small part of what they did. They raised the money, they moved it, and they redecorated it and restored it. I take no credit for that. And the same thing with Annie Beck. Annie Beck, I was able to get the option on Annie Beck's, and when I sold everything, I gave the option to Phil Cheney. Phil Cheney then sold the piece to Shelby Smith. He then moved it down behind the Northern Trust, and then some lady later on bought it, and they moved it over. It's over in the downtown area, north of Sunrise. Those were things that I did not participate in more than get a hold of those and give them to somebody that could afford to move them.
Stan, why don't you get your list now and run down the list of names of people that you became friends with, that you were involved with, that helped you, that you helped them through the years. Would you do that?
I would, Frank, and thank you for letting me tell the story of the people who I dealt with, who helped me, who loaned money to me, who were aided, and who were important people to me over my lifetime. I started with Mrs. Stranahan, Mrs. Cromartie, Annie Beck, George English, Virginia Young, August Burkhart, Gene Whidden was a big George King with the King Motors, Steve Calder, Mrs. Fleming, Dr. Briley, Bob Gore, Sandy Castile, Colonel Mackey, particularly in my life, Jesse Gaddis, Mrs. Bickelhoff, Mrs. Hyde, Mrs. McCahill, Bernie McCormick really helped me a great deal, Arthur Stone, Pop Sterling, Phil Cheney, N.B. Cheney in the early days of gathering all that land, Dick Kowalski, Foy Fleming, Coley Judd helped me a great deal, Fred Millsaps was a savior for financing, Charlie Fletcher, Duncan Britt, Gamble and Gilroy, George Colwell, Bob Cox, Bob Elmore, Rule Elton, Gary Marable, Gene Davis, John Pettit, Carl Jackson, Earl Nightingale, Wallace Kennedy, Ted Drum, Birch Willie, Henry Kinney, Ken Vordemeyer, Phyllis Finney, and Dr. Hyde. They were the people that made my life whatever it was in towns. Thank you. And they all had, that was just not casual. Most of those people had to either bail me out money-wise or help me. And Phil Cheney and his dad did unlimited things. I forgot to add the surveyor, McLaughlin. There were just people who, in those days, helped.
Well, we've been sitting here talking to Stanford K. Smoker. We all know him as Stan Smoker, one of the early pioneers in the development of this beautiful Fort Lauderdale area. And Stan, on behalf of the entire community, thank you for your part to improve this area as you did. You continue to this day. Everyone is so happy that you're doing well, feeling well, and many more decades of good life to you and your family. And until the next time, this is Frank LeConto.
Thank you.
Pennsylvania 6 5000.